These tunnels were built before electricity, before electric motors, before powered ventilation, before modern lighting, and yet they stretch for kilometers beneath major cities. They curve, branch, descend, and reconnect with remarkable precision. They maintain stable airflow. They remain navigable in near total darkness. According to official timelines, none of this should work. When we are taught about underground infrastructure from the 19th century, we're told it was primitive. Manual labor, basic tools, simple engineering solutions. But the structures beneath our cities tell a different story. Because these are not rough tunnels cut into the earth. They are engineered systems, designed environments, built with an understanding of airflow, structural load, alignment, and long-term stability. And here is the problem. Systems like this do not make sense without electricity, yet they existed before it. So, the question is not whether these tunnels exist. The question is how a society without modern power could design and build infrastructure that behaves as if it expects it. According to official history, the explanation is simple. These underground structures were built for practical reasons. They were sewer systems, drainage tunnels, storage corridors, service passages beneath expanding cities. As populations grew during the 19th century, cities needed ways to manage waste, water, and logistics. Engineers responded with underground solutions using the tools and knowledge available at the time. Everything fits neatly within the narrative of industrial progress: manual excavation, brick-lined tunnels, in-gravity-fed systems, occasional gas lamps for light, no electricity required. On paper, the explanation appears reasonable. But when we examine the actual infrastructure, cracks begin to form. These tunnels are not narrow or irregular. Many are wide enough for carts to pass through. Some feature multiple lanes, raised walkways, and reinforced arches. Others descend at precise angles, curve smoothly, and reconnect with other passages far below the surface. This level of complexity is not necessary for simple drainage. Even more puzzling is the consistency. Independent cities, built under different governments, climates, and economic conditions, constructed underground systems that follow remarkably similar design logic. The same dimensions, the same structural patterns, the same emphasis on durability and access. Official history tells us these systems evolved slowly, built piece by piece as cities expanded. But evolution leaves variation. What we see instead is standardization. Another assumption is that these tunnels were rarely used, that they were accessed only for maintenance, that they existed quietly beneath the city, out of sight and out of mind. But the design contradicts that idea. Walkways suggest regular foot traffic. Symmetrical layouts suggest navigation. Carefully spaced ventilation shafts suggest long-term human presence. And this leads to an uncomfortable realization. These spaces were not designed as afterthoughts. They were planned, integrated, and built with expectations of sustained use. If the official explanation were complete, we would expect to see evidence of improvisation, uneven tunnels, inconsistent construction, adaptations made over time. Instead, we see coherence, and coherence implies intention. The official narrative explains why cities needed underground infrastructure, but it does not explain how that infrastructure functions so effectively without technologies it appears to depend on. At this stage, nothing has been disproven, but something important has been overlooked. Because once we move beyond the labels, sewer, tunnel, utility corridor, and begin examining how these systems actually behave, the story stops being straightforward, and the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to believe that these systems were designed for a world without power. Once we move past the question of existence, another issue becomes impossible to ignore. Scale. The underground infrastructure found beneath many cities is not small, it is not isolated, and it is not improvised. We're not looking at a single tunnel or a short passage carved for convenience. What exists beneath the surface are vast interconnected systems, kilometers of tunnels, multiple levels of chambers, carefully graded slopes, consistent dimensions across entire networks. These systems were not dug randomly, they follow precise engineering logic. Drainage tunnels maintain uniform gradients over long distances, ventilation shafts are placed at regular intervals, structural supports appear where load distribution would require them. This level of planning demands more than manual labor. It demands surveying, it demands coordination, and it demands foresight. In modern infrastructure projects, such systems are designed using detailed maps, standardized measurements, and centralized oversight. They require teams of engineers working from unified plans. Yet, many of these underground networks are officially dated to periods before widespread electrical power, before electric lighting, before powered excavation equipment, before modern ventilation systems. This creates a serious contradiction. Digging deep underground without electricity is not simply slower, it is exponentially more dangerous. Without electric lighting, visibility is limited. Without powered ventilation, oxygen levels become unstable. Without machinery, moving excavated material requires enormous human effort. Despite this, the tunnels beneath many cities extend far beyond what would normally be considered practical under such conditions. In some cases, these systems include features that appear unnecessary if the sole purpose was basic drainage. Wide corridors instead of narrow channels, high ceilings instead of compact profiles, smooth, uniform walls rather than rough-cut stone. These design choices suggest that usability mattered, not just function. Complex intersections appear underground, where multiple tunnels converge at precise angles. Flow control chambers regulate water movement across entire districts. Access points are integrated into street layouts above, aligning with buildings and infrastructure that came later. This level of integration implies that the underground network was not an afterthought. It was foundational. And yet, when historians describe the construction of these systems, the explanations often rely on vague phrases. Built gradually, expanded over time, improved as technology advanced. But complexity does not emerge by accident. Highly organized systems do not evolve randomly without leaving clear transitional stages behind. If these networks were expanded slowly, we would expect to see inconsistencies, shifts in tunnel dimensions, changes in construction style, visible adaptations where old sections meet new ones. Instead, many underground systems display remarkable uniformity across long distances. The same dimensions, the same construction methods, the same materials. This uniformity suggests centralized planning, not centuries of patchwork development. Another issue arises when we consider labor. Large underground projects require sustained manpower, logistics, and resource management. Workers need access routes, lighting, air circulation, and waste removal. All of this must operate continuously. Without electricity, these challenges multiply. Yet, there is little evidence of the temporary surface infrastructure that would have been required to support such prolonged underground work. No massive worker camps, no extensive spoil heaps, no long-term disruptions recorded in surrounding neighborhoods. The scale of the underground systems does not match the scale of disruption documented above ground. That mismatch matters because large projects leave footprints. They reshape cities, they alter economies, they leave records. But when we search for those records, we find silence or fragments that do not match the physical reality below. At this point, the problem is no longer whether underground infrastructure existed early. The problem is whether our assumptions about how it was built are sufficient. If these systems were not created slowly, with limited tools and under extreme constraints, then they may not belong entirely to the era they are assigned to. That does not mean we know when they were built, or by whom, or why. It simply means that the scale and complexity of what lies beneath our cities exceed what the official explanations comfortably account for. And when infrastructure refuses to fit its timeline, the timeline deserves closer examination. Once scale and complexity are acknowledged, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore: precision. The underground infrastructure beneath many cities does not just exist, it is consistent. Tunnels maintain uniform widths for long distances, ceiling heights remain stable across entire sections, curves follow smooth, predictable arcs rather than irregular deviations. This level of precision is not typical of early, manually excavated systems. When work is done slowly, by different crews across long periods of time, variation appears, measurements drift, techniques change, styles evolve. But beneath our cities, variation is surprisingly rare. In many underground networks, tunnels intersect at standardized angles, junctions are symmetrical, support structures repeat with near-identical spacing. This is not what improvisation looks like. It resembles industrial standardization, the kind we associate with modern engineering. In several cities, drainage tunnels share nearly identical dimensions, despite being separated by great distances. Brickwork follows repeating patterns. Stone blocks are cut to uniform sizes. This raises a critical question. Standardization requires planning before construction begins. It requires decisions about measurements, materials, and tolerances to be made in advance, and then followed consistently across the entire project. That is difficult to achieve, even today. Without modern surveying equipment, maintaining consistent slopes and dimensions underground becomes extremely challenging. Small errors compound over distance, misalignments grow. Yet, in many historical underground systems, gradients remain stable over hundreds of meters. Water flows exactly where it is intended to flow. Ventilation shafts align cleanly with passages below. Structural loads are distributed predictably. This suggests that these systems were not built in isolated segments. They were built as unified designs. Another detail reinforces this impression. In multiple cities, underground tunnels align with surface streets that were officially laid out later. Access points correspond with buildings that did not yet exist when the tunnels were supposedly constructed. This implies one of two things. Either the underground systems were repeatedly modified with extraordinary accuracy as cities grew above them, or the underground layout influenced the city that came later. Standardization also appears in materials. Brick dimensions remain consistent across entire networks. Mortar composition shows little variation. Stonework follows repeated construction rules. This consistency suggests controlled sourcing and coordinated construction, not ad hoc repair or gradual expansion. In early infrastructure projects, especially those built over decades, materials usually vary. Suppliers change, techniques evolve, quality fluctuates. But beneath our cities, the underground layers often look as though they were built within a relatively narrow window of time. The uniformity feels intentional, and intention matters, because precision is not accidental. It reflects priorities. Someone cared about alignment, someone cared about repeatability, someone cared about system-wide coherence. But these are not qualities typically associated with emergency construction or short-term solutions. They suggest confidence, the expectation that the system would endure. This creates tension with the idea that these networks were primitive or transitional. Primitive systems are messy. They adapt as they go. They improve unevenly. What we see instead looks refined from the beginning, and refinement implies experience. If this level of underground engineering was already standardized, then it did not emerge suddenly. It likely evolved from earlier knowledge. That does not mean we know where that knowledge came from. It does not tell us who applied it, But it does challenge the assumption that these systems represent the first attempts at underground infrastructure. They look more like mature solutions, and mature solutions usually sit at the end of a developmental process, not the beginning. At this point, the evidence beneath our cities is no longer just impressive, it is suggestive. It suggests that underground infrastructure may have followed rules we no longer fully recognize, rules that were applied consistently, rules that shaped cities quietly, rules that left behind systems so precise they still function today. And if these rules existed before modern technology, then our understanding of technological timelines deserves closer scrutiny, because precision does not appear without precedent. At this stage, the underground infrastructure beneath our cities raises a different kind of question. Not about engineering, but about people. Because once we step inside these spaces, something feels unexpected. They do not feel like places meant to be visited briefly. They do not feel like maintenance corridors. They do not feel like environments designed only for machines or waste. They feel usable. Many underground tunnels include raised walkways that run alongside channels. These walkways are level, wide enough for regular foot traffic, positioned safely above water flow. This is not necessary for drainage alone. If a tunnel's only purpose were to move water, a narrow channel would suffice. Access could be occasional, maintenance could be limited. Instead, what we find suggests regular movement through these spaces. Lighting reinforces this impression. In numerous underground systems, niches appear at regular intervals along the walls. They are evenly spaced, consistently shaped, positioned at heights that make sense for illumination. These niches are not random cavities, they appear intentional. Official explanations often describe them as holders for oil lamps or gas lights, but this raises new problems. Oil lamps produce smoke, gas lighting consumes oxygen. Both generate heat. In confined underground environments, these factors become serious hazards. Yet, the layout of many tunnels does not prioritize rapid smoke evacuation. Ceilings are often flat rather than sharply vaulted. Ventilation shafts are present, but not concentrated where heavy smoke would accumulate. This suggests that constant open flames were not the primary design assumption. Airflow presents an even greater puzzle. Many underground networks maintain stable air circulation without any visible mechanical assistance. Air moves slowly but consistently through long passages. Temperature remains relatively stable year-round. This is not accidental. Air behaves predictably, only when spaces are designed with airflow in mind. Ventilation shafts are positioned to create pressure differences. Passages align in ways that allow air to move naturally. Such systems are complex to design even today. Without fans or powered circulation, airflow must rely on precise geometry and elevation differences. Small errors can render ventilation ineffective. Yet, in many underground systems, air quality remains surprisingly manageable. This raises an important question. Why would engineers invest so much effort into creating breathable underground environments if human presence was meant to be minimal? Usability extends beyond air and light. Ceiling heights often allow people to stand comfortably. Corners are chamfered rather than sharp. Surfaces are smooth enough to move along safely. These details matter. They suggest consideration for the human body, not just structural necessity. In several cities, underground spaces connect directly to buildings above. Doorways open into tunnels. Staircases descend into passages that align naturally with corridors below. This level of integration suggests that underground spaces were not separate from daily life. They were part of it. Official narratives often frame underground infrastructure as hidden and secondary, out of sight, out of use. But the design tells a different story. These spaces appear designed to be accessed repeatedly, traversed regularly. occupied for meaningful periods of time. That does not mean they were public streets or marketplaces, but it does suggest they were functional environments, not emergency solutions. Another detail strengthens this interpretation. In some underground systems, wayfinding elements appear, changes in wall texture, subtle variations in tunnel width, visual cues that help orientation. These are not required for drainage. They are helpful only when people need to navigate. At this point, the underground infrastructure stops feeling like background machinery. It begins to feel like a parallel layer of the city, a layer where movement, access, and usability were considered from the beginning. And this leads to a fundamental tension. If these spaces were designed for people, then their role was more significant than official explanations suggest. They were not merely supporting systems, they were environments, and environments require purpose. Whatever that purpose was, it demanded light, air, and human comfort, even in a world without electricity. Once human usability is acknowledged, the final technical question becomes unavoidable. Is this unique? If the underground infrastructure beneath one city were unusually advanced, it might be dismissed as a local innovation, a product of exceptional engineers or unusual circumstances. But when similar systems appear across the world, coincidence becomes difficult to accept. Cities separated by oceans, cultures, and political systems reveal underground structures that follow strikingly similar principles. In Paris, extensive tunnel networks extend far beyond what is required for drainage alone. They include walkable corridors, consistent ventilation shafts, and structural reinforcements designed for long-term stability. In London, subterranean passages beneath the city show comparable tunnel dimensions and airflow behavior. These sections align beneath streets that were laid out later, suggesting that the underground network influenced the surface above. Rome offers a layered city unlike any other. Modern infrastructure rests directly on top of older underground systems, some of which display planning logic that does not align with the era they're assigned to. Across the Atlantic, cities in North America show the same patterns. In New York, underground utility tunnels and abandoned passages reveal standardized dimensions and access points integrated into early urban layouts. Chicago's layered streets expose multiple levels of underground infrastructure, stacked with remarkable consistency. Montreal contains underground passages and foundations that predate much of the visible city, yet align seamlessly with later development. And these cities did not share blueprints. They were not governed by the same authorities. They did not respond to identical local challenges. And yet, the underground logic looks familiar. The same emphasis on accessibility, the same concern for airflow, the same structural language. This suggests that the underground systems were not isolated solutions. They appear to be expressions of a shared approach to urban infrastructure, not a shared event, not a single catastrophe, but a shared way of thinking. One explanation is that cities inherited underground systems and adapted them over time. Rather than design entirely new infrastructure, planners built upon what already existed. Another possibility is that similar constraints led different cities to arrive at similar solutions independently. But independent solutions usually show variation. Local materials, different dimensions, unique layouts. What we see instead is convergence, not identical systems, but recognizable patterns. This raises a deeper question. Why would cities across the world invest so heavily in underground environments that function as complete systems rather than isolated utilities? Underground construction is expensive. It is difficult. It requires long-term commitment. Cities rarely choose it unless surface space is insufficient, or existing structures make expansion impossible. This implies that something about these urban environments made underground development not only practical, but necessary. And necessity tends to follow precedent. If underground infrastructure already existed and proved reliable, expanding it would have made sense. If it already shaped the city's layout, ignoring it would have been inefficient. Over time, the underground layer would become invisible, accepted, taken for granted. The city above would change, the city below would remain. This pattern does not require hidden knowledge or secret builders. It only requires continuity. Systems built for long-term use tend to outlive the context that created them. Their purpose fades, their origins blur. What remains is function, and when function persists across centuries, it can mask its own history. At this stage, the underground infrastructure beneath our cities no longer appears as a collection of technical curiosities. It begins to look like a global phenomenon, a quiet, structural layer of urban life that spans continents and eras. And when a pattern appears on this scale, the question is no longer if it matters. The question is what kind of world required it. Once a global pattern becomes visible, the final technical question cannot be avoided. Purpose. If underground infrastructure on this scale was not built randomly, then it was built for something. Official explanations tend to narrow the answer to utilities, drainage, waste management, occasional storage. But the systems beneath our cities appear too versatile for a single function. They are not optimized only for water. They are not optimized only for access. They are not optimized only for ventilation. They are optimized for use. One interpretation suggests that these underground networks were inherited frameworks, structures already in place, later adapted to new needs as cities evolved above them. In this view, the tunnels were not designed for one specific task. They were designed as multi-purpose environments. Water could flow through them, people could move through them, air could circulate through them. This kind of flexibility is expensive to build, but it is efficient to reuse. Another interpretation focuses on logistics. Before modern transportation, moving goods through dense cities was slow and disruptive. Underground routes could have allowed movement beneath crowded streets, protected from weather, separated from surface congestion, wide corridors, smooth floors, consistent gradients. These features make sense in that context. There is also the question of climate control. Underground spaces maintain stable temperatures, cooler in summer, warmer in winter. In periods of extreme heat, cold, or pollution, underground environments offer refuge. Not permanent living spaces, but functional extensions of the city. Some researchers suggest that underground infrastructure may have supported industrial processes that required stable conditions, storage of sensitive materials, processing environments, workspaces protected from surface hazards. These interpretations do not require advanced technology beyond what we see physically present. They require planning, they require foresight, they require a worldview that treats the underground not as a last resort, but as an integral layer of the city. Another possibility is that these systems were designed to serve multiple futures. Infrastructure built with excess capacity often appears mysterious later. When its original purpose fades, what remains seems oversized. Wide tunnels become too large. Ventilation becomes too advanced. Access points become unnecessary. But overbuilding is not irrational when longevity is the goal. If a system is expected to last centuries, building it generously makes sense. This would explain why so much underground infrastructure still functions today, even if its role has changed. What complicates this interpretation is timing. Many of these systems appear fully realized early in their documented history. They do not show signs of tentative experimentation. They do not look like first attempts. They look confident. Confidence suggests experience, and experience suggests continuity. This does not mean we need to assume lost technologies or forgotten civilizations. It only requires us to consider that urban knowledge can persist quietly. You're passed forward, adapted, renamed. As cities changed, the underground layer may have remained stable, out of sight, out of discussion, but not out of use. Eventually, as electricity, engines, and modern systems arrived, these underground spaces were repurposed again. Cables replaced walkways, pipes replaced corridors, machines replaced people. The original intent faded, replaced by new functions that fit the same geometry. This process does not erase the past. It obscures it. And once obscured, the system begins to look anomalous, too advanced, too large, too well designed. But anomalies often arise not from mystery, but from missing context. At this point, we do not need to know exactly what these systems were for. What matters is that they were designed to support human activity in complex, sustained ways. They were not accidents. They were not temporary. They were not improvisations. They were infrastructure, and infrastructure reflects priorities. Whatever world produced these underground systems prioritized continuity, adaptability, and long-term use. Even without the technologies we now associate with such capabilities, that realization does not rewrite history, it expands it. At this point, the question is no longer whether underground infrastructure existed before electricity. The evidence makes that clear. The question is what it tells us about how cities actually developed. Some researchers suggest that what we now call underground infrastructure may not have been conceived as underground at all. Instead, it may represent an earlier layer of urban planning, one that was later enclosed, repurposed, or built over as cities expanded. In this view, tunnels, corridors, and chambers were not hidden utilities. They were functional parts of a living city, gradually redefined as surface conditions changed. Others point to periods of rapid transformation. Fires, floods, economic shifts, and political restructuring often forced cities to rebuild quickly in such moments. That reuse becomes more practical than replacement. Existing infrastructure is preserved not because it is understood, but because it works. Rather than dismantle complex systems, cities adapt around them. There is also the possibility that underground infrastructure was designed with longevity in mind. Systems meant to endure across generations are often built with excess capacity. They appear oversized only after their original context fades. When purpose is lost, structure becomes mysterious. This does not require lost technologies or forgotten civilizations. It only requires continuity without explanation. Knowledge passed forward informally, functions changing without documentation, systems surviving while their stories do not. History often focuses on visible change, new streets, new buildings, new technologies. But infrastructure rarely announces itself. It persists quietly beneath daily life. And when that persistence spans centuries, it begins to look anomalous. What makes the underground infrastructure beneath our cities so compelling is not that it contradicts history, but that it complicates it. It reveals layers of decision-making that were practical at the time, yet poorly recorded. Cities are not rebuilt from nothing. They are reconfigured. They absorb what already exists. They adapt it. And eventually they forget why it was there in the first place. The underground systems beneath our feet may be examples of that process, not evidence of something extraordinary, but evidence of something enduring. If we remove the expectation that every system must align neatly with modern timelines, the picture becomes clearer. These structures do not demand radical explanations. They demand careful observation. They ask us to consider that urban history is layered, not linear, and that what we see on the surface is often only the final draft. The earlier versions remain below, unseen, functional, waiting. If this exploration has changed how you look at the spaces beneath your city, subways, tunnels, basements, corridors, then it has done its job. Because understanding history does not always mean finding new answers. Sometimes it means asking better questions. Future episodes will continue to examine forgotten infrastructure, buried urban layers, and the physical evidence hidden beneath modern life, not to claim final conclusions, but to document what remains when memory fades. Stay observant, stay curious, and pay attention to what lies beneath the streets you walk every day.